The note said just one thing, written over and over, filling the whole page. Matt is the father. The man who read it was Matt himself. His mother never knew that note existed, not even on her deathbed, when she named a different man as the father. A family torn in two by a single piece of paper, a suicide, and a secret that could never be confirmed. This novel is a far-flung life, a million-acre sheep station in the heart of Western Australia, and a family whose every bond is woven from silence. For end of Pactabs and number of Screebs Chervers Ropede. If knowing the truth meant tearing apart everyone you love, would you still want to dig for it? Episode 1. The Crash on the Boundary. The Bedford truck ate the red miles of the Vermin fence track without complaint, carrying the three MacBride men toward town and toward something none of them saw coming. Phil McBride drove his dark hair and oval face, a template that had been repeated in his sons since the day they were born. Same straight hair, same long chin, same way of squinting into the western sun. Warren, the eldest, sat in the middle, punching his little brother's arm every time Matt said something that qualified in Warren's book. As Bulldust, Matt McBride, the youngest, had spent the whole journey daydreaming about the family boat, a 30-foot ketch called the Willina, and the fish he was going to catch once they launched her near Port Grace. A's. Ahead, the sun was low enough to make shadows, but the heat hadn't broken. The road stretched straight and empty, the way outback roads do when nothing has moved on them for days. Phil was talking about the ramp they'd need to build at the loading dock, and Matt was already tasting salt on his lips when a red kangaroo bounded out of the scrub. Phil swore and wrenched the wheel left to avoid it. The mistake was in the size. Phil told himself later, or would have, if had lived, that the shape had looked like a stockman, a man in the middle of nowhere, waving him down. That's what made him swerve instead of brake. But the kangaroo was already gone, long-legged and indifferent, and the Bedford's front wheel caught the soft shoulder of the road at 50 miles an hour. The truck rolled. It didn't flip cleanly. It turned over twice, tearing through the fence and landing on its side in a cradle of crushed mulga. The chassis crumpled and the petrol tank ruptured. Warren was thrown forward, and the gear stick, a steel lever with a worn rubber grip, punched through his chest like a spike through a hide. Phil was alive long enough to drag Warren clear of the cab, clear of the fire that was beginning to catch in the splashed petrol. He died there, beside his eldest son, with the smell of burning wool filling the gap where speech should have been. Matt was flung through the windscreen. He landed 30 feet away, his skull cracked, his brain swelling, his heart beating thin and fast in a body that was already forgetting how to hold itself together. Sneaky Snook, the mail contractor, found them less than an hour later. His dog Lightning had smelled the smoke from half a mile off, and when the old mail truck rounded the bend, the sight that met Sneaky was not unlike a grisly barbecue sheep carcasses caged and burned in the truck's bars, the air heavy with the smell of cooked meat. Warren was propped on one elbow, still conscious, still ordering Sneaky to get the sheep back, still swearing. Phil lay beside him, already gone. Matt was a broken shape in the dirt, and Lightning had to lick his face twice before his eyelids fluttered. At the homestead on Meredith Downs, Lorna McBride was baking her youngest son's birthday cake. The knock at the door came mid-afternoon. The policeman's face told her before his mouth had a chance. She stood in the doorway with the flower still on her arms, and the world divided into everything before that moment and everything after. Rose, the daughter, came up behind her and stood silent, as if the doctor might somehow discover the whole story of what she had done. What Rose had done was not yet visible to anyone. It was a secret she carried like a stone in her chest, and it would stay there for months, pressing against her lungs, until it finally forced its way out in ways no one could have predicted. The Waking. Matt woke a week later, and the first thing he did was hit his mother. Lorna had leaned down to kiss his cheek, and his hand came up before his brain knew what it was doing. The slap caught her hard across the face. "Piss off," he snarled, his voice raw and unfamiliar even to himself. A nurse intervened, explaining that disorientation was normal after traumatic encephalopathy. The doctor, a man named Linto, pulled Lorna aside and told her the prognosis: amnesia, labile moods, poor judgment, a personality that might never fully return. He advised against telling Matt about the deaths of his father and brother. At least for now, the risk of paranoia, even suicide, was too high. Lorna sat beside her son's bed and watched him sleep. and she understood that the boy who had left in the Bedford truck was not coming home. The body was the same, the face was the same, but whatever lived behind those eyes had been rearranged into something foreign, something she would have to learn to love from scratch. Rose came to the hospital too, and when she sat in the corner of the ward, the silence around her was heavier than furniture. She watched the doctors move around Matt's bed, and she thought about the date, the 10th of January, the day she had engineered everything. The swap had been her idea. A simple plan, really. Rose had been meant to go to the Young Pastoralists Association meeting that Saturday. Matt was supposed to go with their father and brother to Proserpine Mine, where a government geologist was giving a talk on mineral rights, a subject that interested Rose far more than the patronage of the Queen Mother, who was due to visit Western Australia that March. The YPA committee was busy planning the royal route, and Rose had no patience for bunting and protocol. The mine, though, that was different. The English trainee manager was going to be there. The English trainee manager, Lord Beaumont's youngest son, with his pale green monogrammed suitcases and his croquet set and his hands that could play the Moonlight Sonata on a piano with missing keys, the man Rose had fallen for the moment she saw him step off the mail truck, and who had made it painfully clear in 100 small ways that he was not interested. But the mine trip was a chance. A day away from the homestead, from Lorna's watchful eye, from Warren's hard jokes. A day to walk beside the Englishman through the old Proserpine workings, to show him the vein of copper that ran through the eastern face, to make him see her as something more than the station girl who brought him blankets. She had convinced Matt to swap. It wasn't hard. She had told him Patty Gosden would be at the YPA meeting, and Matt had always been soft on Patty, so had climbed into the Bedford beside Phil and Warren, and Rose had watched the truck disappear down the track, its dust hanging in the air long after the sound of the engine faded. She had not thought about the kangaroo. She had not thought about the soft shoulder of the road, the roll, the fire. She had only thought about the Englishman now Matt was in hospital with a brain that no longer remembered what his own father looked like, and Rose sat in the corner of the ward, a witness to her own crime, and said nothing. The shed. Matt came home for a weekend trial in March, 2 months after the crash. Dr. Fairchild had approved the visit, cautioning Lorna that confronting experiences could trigger disorientation, but that familiar surroundings were generally beneficial. The theory was sound. The practice was devastating. When Matt stepped out of the car, he looked at the homestead as if had never seen it before. "Where are Dad and Warren?" he asked, and Lorna had to tell him again that they were dead. He collapsed, his knees hitting the gravel, and a sound came out of him that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. Rose helped him inside, and the Englishman, still at the station, still filling the role of caretaker-manager, steered the dinner conversation toward neutral ground, away from grief and toward the weather, the sheep, the old purling lugger that had belonged to Monty MacBride. The next day, a storm rolled in. Matt and Rose took shelter in the shearing shed, and the weight of the sound and the smell and the darkness pressed in on him until he couldn't hold it anymore. He cried in the wool dust, touching the fleeces, feeling the familiarity of something he could no longer fully grasp. "Nothing's right anymore," he said, and Rose held him. She shouldn't have. She knew she shouldn't. But the rain was drumming on the iron roof and Matt was weeping into her shoulder, and somewhere in the back of the shed, hidden behind a stack of crates, Warren had stashed a bottle of whiskey and 2 cans of beer. They drank. Matt drank to silence the noise in his head. Rose drank to keep him from drinking more. They played cards in the dim light, and then they stopped playing. The rain was a curtain. The wool was a mattress, and something happened between them that neither of them had words for, something that began with a kiss on the forehead and ended with Rose waking at dawn to find Matt's arm across her, his body warm and unconscious, his mind still lost in whatever fog had swallowed it the night before. She checked his pulse. She rolled him onto his side, into the recovery position. She dressed him, dragged him to the Land Rover, and drove him back to the hospital, her hands steady on the wheel even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The roads were a mess. She drove straight through the puddles, using the hard-packed dirt beneath to stay mobile. When Lorna found out, she was furious. Not at Matt, never at Matt, but at Rose. "You led him into trouble," Lorna said, her voice low and sharp. "Stay away from him. Don't bring any more trouble to this house." Rose said nothing. She took the blame, as she always did. But inside, She was thinking about the word Yawa, the backward word she and Matt had invented as children, the word they said when they burned their written confessions and watched the smoke carry their sins away. She needed a fire. She needed to burn something. She needed to make the truth disappear. The note. The adoption was arranged by a Mrs. Blencombe from the Anglican Society for the Australian Family. Rose had gone to Port Grace by then, far from Meredith Downs, working as a bookkeeper at Ernestine Bobinak's meatworks under a false name. She had told no one about the pregnancy. She had felt the changes in her body and attributed them to the heat, the stress, the guilt. When she fainted at work and Dr. Dalby examined her, the diagnosis was 5 months pregnant. She could not go home. She would not go home. Ernestine, a stout widow with a chain smoker's laugh and a soft spot for strays, offered her a room and a pay rise and a job that asked no questions. Rose took it. She worked through the pregnancy in a haze of numbers and ledger entries, counting other people's money to avoid counting her own mistakes. The child was born in December. A boy. She held him once, briefly, before the flying doctor arrived and recognized her Rose MacBride. Is that you? And then there was no more hiding. She returned to Meredith Downs, a stiff stranger carrying an unnamed infant, and Lorna took over as if the child were a station asset that needed managing. The adoption was supposed to be the answer. Mrs. Blencombe had the papers ready. The couple was lined up young, church-going, financially stable, the wife unable to bear children of her own. Rose was supposed to sign, and then the infant would become someone else's story, someone else's burden, someone else's chance at redemption. But Rose couldn't sign, not because she loved the infant, she wasn't sure she had the capacity for love anymore, but because the adoption papers required a birth registration. And the birth registration required a father's name, and the father's name was a truth she could not put in writing. Not out loud, not on paper, not anywhere. So she tried another kind of writing. On a hidden sheet of paper, in the privacy of her childhood room, she wrote the same words over and over in capital letters. Mattisthether. 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 She planned to burn it. That was the ritual. Write the sin, light the match, say Yawa, watch it turn to ash. She had the lighter ready, the same brass one she had stolen from a shearer years ago. But before she could strike the flame, a wasp stung the infant's arm, and Lorna snatched the child away, and the note was forgotten in the mattress where Rose had hidden it. She left it there. It stayed. The mine. On the night of January the 10th, 1959, exactly 1 year after the crash, Rose took the infant and drove. She drove to Pete Peachy's camp first. The ruse shooter was the only man she trusted, the only one who had ever looked at her without wanting something, without judging, for a posthumous violation. She asked if he would take the child. He refused. You need to go home, Rose, he said gently. You need to face this. Wasn't always just a ruse shooter, you know? I know what it is to carry something you can't put down. She drove home. She put the infant in his carry basket. And then, in the small hours of the morning, when the house was dark and Lorna was asleep, and the wind was low, and the stars were sharp as broken glass, she took the child and drove to Proserpine Mine. The shaft was deep. The darkness at the bottom was absolute. She stood at the edge with the infant in her arms, and she truly believed, that she was doing the merciful thing. You don't just wait and hope for the best, she whispered. You put it out of its misery. She jumped. The fall broke her neck and crushed her skull. The infant, wrapped in blankets, thrown clear by the impact, landed a few feet away on a ledge of soft earth, alive. He had a gash above his eyebrow that would scar into a white crescent, a permanent mark of the night he almost died before his mother did. Pete found them at dawn. Had followed the tracks from her visit to his camp, driven by a dread he couldn't name. He climbed down the shaft, lifted the crying infant, and climbed out again, his hand steady, his face unreadable. Rose's body was left at the bottom. Sergeant Wishart, the local policeman, took one look at the scene and made a decision. No suicide inquest, no scandal, no further punishment for a family that had already lost too much. The death was ruled a fall. The child was given a name, Andy MacBride, and the father's field on the birth certificate was left blank. Lorna raised him. She wrapped him in love and silence, two ingredients that don't always blend well. She told him his mother had died in an accident. She told him nothing about his father. She told him the scar on his eyebrow was from a fall, and that was all. But the truth was buried in a mattress, on a folded sheet of paper, beside a brass lighter, and nobody knew. The burning. Matt found the note in 1960. He was cleaning Rose's room, or rather, he was avoiding cleaning anything else, and his hand slipped between the mattress and the bed frame, looking for a lost sock. His fingers found paper. He pulled it out. The words hit him like the truck had hit him in 1958. Matthieffather. Matthieffather. But Mittisteffather, over and over, in Rose's handwriting, in capital letters, as if she had been trying to convince the paper itself. He read it, standing in the middle of her room, and the floor tilted under him, and he collapsed. He did not remember. He had never remembered. The night in the shearing shed was a void in his brain, a hole where memory should have been, and this note was a match held to the edge of that hole, showing him only the shape of what was missing. He understood, then, what Rose had been carrying. He understood why she had recoiled from his kiss. He understood why she had looked at him with a mixture of love and terror that no sibling should ever have in their eyes. He did not understand why she had tried to kill the child, but he understood that she had, and that the child had lived, and that the child was his. Matt took the note to Wallaby Ridge, the high point on the station where he and Rose had burned their childhood confessions. He sat on the red earth as the sun dropped behind the mulga, and he held a match to the paper, and he said the old word, Yawa. The flame caught, the paper curled, the words blackened and dissolved into ash. Nothing changed. He had expected the ritual to release him, the way it had when he was 10 years old and burning the memory of a stolen biscuit. But this was not a stolen biscuit. This was his sister, dead at the bottom of a mine. This was his child, alive in the homestead. This was a truth that would not burn no matter how many matches he held to it. Matt stayed on the ridge until the stars came out. Then he stood up, dusted the ash from his hands, and walked back to the house. He did not know how he would raise the boy. He did not know how he would keep the secret. He did not know if the love he felt for Andy was love or guilt or duty or all three tangled together, but he knew he would stay. He had lost the right to run. He had lost the right to be the one who got away. The note was gone. The truth remained. The wait. The years passed. The station settled into a rhythm without the MacBride men, then without Rose, then without the parts of the story that anyone could bear to speak aloud. Matt's brain healed slowly, imperfectly. He would always walk with a slight drag in his left foot, always forget the word for paddock when he was tired, always feel the shape of a memory that refused to take form. But he could ride, he could muster, he could sign the station's name on the bank forms that kept the whole enterprise from collapsing. Lorna raised Andy. She told him stories about his mother that were mostly true, and she told him nothing about his father, because she believed with a certainty that bordered on faith that the Englishman had been the man. The flourish on the initials in the diary, the way Rose had written those two letters with a loop and a curl that Lorna recognized as a signature of love that was her proof. She held it close, a secret she would carry to her grave. Matt let her believe it. He had his own proof, crumpled and red and burned, and he carried it in a different kind of silence. Andy grew. He learned not to ask about his father, because the air got too heavy when he did. He learned that some questions didn't have answers, or if they did, the answers were locked in rooms he wasn't allowed to enter. He found his mother's fruit crate in the back of the storage shed, and he visited it when no one was watching, tracing the spine of her Bible, listening to her shellac disc of My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, imagining the voice of a woman he had never known. He had a theory. He called it forgetment, the opposite of a memory, the space where something had been and was now missing. He thought about it when he looked at the scar beside his eyebrow. He thought about it when he read the inscription in his mother's Bible, from a godmother he would never meet. He thought about it when he stood in the cemetery and talked to the graves of strangers, pretending each one might be his father. He was 10 years old in 1969, and he had no idea that the man who had carried him as a baby, the man who had burned a confession on a ridge at sunset, was the answer to a question he had stopped asking. The station was under pressure now. Synthetics had collapsed the wool price, and mining companies were sniffing at the boundaries, offering dollars for the right to dig holes in the land. A geologist named Bonnie Edquist was about to drive through the gate, and she would bring with her a fresh set of questions, all the ones the MacBrides had been too afraid to ask. But that was still to come. For now, Matt stood on the veranda with Andy beside him, watching the red dust settle on the long track to the gate. He put his hand on Andy's shoulder and felt the weight of everything he could not say. He said nothing. That was the MacBride way. Episode 2, The Geologist at the Dam. 10 years after the crash, the wrecked truck still sat where it had been dragged, a rusted monument at the edge of the boundary paddock, half swallowed by saltbush and red dust. The windscreen was a web of fractures, the cab door hanging open like a broken jaw. Inside, the smell of old oil and scorched metal had faded to something faint and mineral, but the steering wheel still wore the grooves of Phil MacBride's hands. Andy MacBride knew every inch of that truck. He came here when he needed to think. When the questions in his head got too loud, he would climb into the driver's seat, stretch his arms to reach the wheel, and imagine his mother sitting beside him. He never told anyone he did this. It was his own kind of yawa, a backward word for things that couldn't be spoken. He was 10 years old in the summer of 1969, with a crescent scar above his eyebrow that had been told came from a fall. He didn't remember the fall. He remembered nothing before the age of 3, just a blank stretch of years where his mother should have been. Lorna had told him the story. Rose died in an accident at the mine, a terrible fall, and Andy had been with her, but survived. That was the official version, the one that came out at dinner when he pressed too hard. He had learned to stop pressing. The air pressure changed when he did, a heaviness that settled over Lorna's face and made Matt stare at his plate. So he pressed only in private, in the fruit crate. Lorna had forbidden him from touching the family fruit crates, but when she was in the orchard and Matt was out with the hands, Andy would slip into the storage shed and lift the lid of his mother's crate. Inside, a knitted sheep named Ramsey that he kept under his pillow, 2 dolls with blinking eyes, a shellac disc of My Love is Like a red rose that he had played so many times the grooves were wearing thin, and a poem called Jemima's Trees, written by Rose when she was 14. The poem was about a woman who planted trees in a landscape that didn't want them, and the woman's name was Jemima, and the trees were eucalypts that grew crooked and tough against the salt wind. Andy didn't understand all of it, but he understood that his mother had written it, and that made it holy. He had another word he used when he thought about the gaps in his life. He called it forgetment, the opposite of a memory, the shape of something that had been there and was now missing. He had a whole theory about it. He had told Matt once, during a mill run, and Matt had gone quiet for a long time before saying, "There are memories I'll never get back. And some I don't want." Andy didn't ask which ones Matt didn't want. He knew better. The Woman in the Dam. On Saturday, the 11th of January, 1969, Andy and Matt were doing their fortnightly mill run, checking the windmill pumps and filling the troughs. The heat was brutal, 115 degrees in the shade, the air thick with flies. They crested a rise near the eastern boundary dam, and Andy saw something that made him point. "Matt, there's a white car." It was a Land Rover parked at the edge of the dam. No, not parked abandoned. The driver's door was open. Clothes lay in a heap on the muddy bank, and in the water, floating on her back, was a woman, naked. Matt stopped the ute. "Stay here," said, but Andy was already out of the cab, running toward the dam. The woman saw them and let out a yelp, scrambling for cover, but there was no cover, just open red dirt and a few salt bushes. She grabbed a towel and wrapped it around herself, standing waist deep in the muddy water. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Matt shouted. "Swimming," she shouted back. "It's 115 degrees. This is private property." "I know." The gate was open. Matt's jaw tightened. He turned to Andy. "Get back in the ute." But Andy was already staring at the woman. She had short brown hair and a sunburned nose, and she looked more embarrassed than scared. She waded to the bank, keeping the towel in place, and said, "I'm Bonnie. I'm a geologist with Hollamby Mining. We're surveying this area. You're on my land," Matt said. "Technically, it's crown land under pastoral lease." The geologist reached for her clothes, pulled a shirt over her head. "And I have a miner's right. It cost 50 cents. It gives me legal access to prospect." She held up a folded document. "See, Regulation 5A. I can enter, peg claims, take samples. I'm required to give you notice, which I was planning to do today, but I got here early. Matt took the document, read it, handed it back. His face was hard. You can have your legal right, but you can't have the water. That dam is for my stock. You want to swim? Do it somewhere else. The geologist pulled on her trousers. Fair enough. I'll come by the homestead tomorrow, introduce myself properly. And I'll bring a map of our claim area. She climbed into her Land Rover, gave Andy a half smile, and drove off. Andy watched her go. She seems nice, he said. Matt didn't answer. He was already thinking about the legal threat, how a 50-cent license could let strangers tear up the ground, damage fences, poison troughs, and take minerals that might have kept Meredith Downs alive. He had seen it happen to other stations. The mining companies didn't care about the land. They only cared about what was underneath it. The postmaster's wife. In Wandery Creek, a different kind of investigation was underway. The postmaster's wife had been in town for 3 years, and she had already earned a nickname, the funeral fanatic. She attended every funeral within 100 miles, whether she knew the deceased or not. She sat in the back row, took a pamphlet, and later filed it in a drawer she called her Drawers of Death. She annotated each pamphlet with shorthand notes, cause of death, suspicious circumstances, questions that needed answers. Her special interest was the MacBride family. There had been so many deaths: Phil and Warren in the truck crash, Rose at the mine, and the baby who somehow survived. She had collected every funeral notice, every newspaper clipping, every scrap of gossip. She had a whole section in her archive under MacBride. She whispered her theories to her rosebush, a Lorraine Lee, that she had planted in the back garden, and the rosebush never told her she was wrong. There's something not right about that family, she told the rosebush one afternoon, after a parcel addressed to Meredith Downs had torn open in the mail. Inside was a silk negligee from George's of Melbourne, marked Adam P. Peachy Esquire. P. Peachy, the rue shooter. The postmaster's wife narrowed her eyes. A negligee? For a man who lived alone in a tent? She made a note in her black book. Peachy possible lover? She didn't know yet what she was looking for, but she was watching. That was enough. The crash and the rescue. 2 weeks after the dam incident, Bonnie came to the homestead to negotiate supplies. She brought legal summaries and a map of claim areas. Lorna served tea, and Matt grudgingly agreed to sell her fuel and meat at cost. The conversation was stiff but civil. The geologist left with a full tank and a promise to stay out of the stock dams. She didn't get far. On the track back to her camp, she hit a patch of loose gravel, swerved to avoid a goanna, and flipped the Land Rover into a dry creek bed. She was unconscious when Matt found her, her head lolling against the cracked windscreen, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. He carried her to his ute, drove her to the homestead, and laid her on the spare bed. Lorna cleaned the wound while Matt used the cognition tests he remembered from his own brain injury: name, date, age. Bonnie answered groggily, her eyes unfocused. She stayed overnight, and by morning she was lucid enough to eat breakfast with Andy, who sat across from her and showed her his rock collection. This is a tektite, Andy said, holding up a dark melted stone. It's from a meteorite impact. It fell out of the sky and got completely reformed. The geologist turned it over in her hand. You know your rocks. I know a bit. Andy hesitated. I don't know my father. He's a forgetment. Bonnie looked at him. What's a forgetment? Something that used to be there and now it's missing. Like a memory that got lost. I think about my father a lot. I don't know if he's alive or dead. I don't know his name. She didn't know what to say. She looked to Matt, who was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. She saw something flicker in his eyes, pain maybe, or guilt, and she knew there was more to this story than a missing father. The photo that burned. 3 years before Bonnie arrived, Matt had found something he never meant to. In 1966, while cleaning out a vacant house on the station, he had discovered a photograph tucked behind a loose floorboard. It showed a young man in military uniform, handsomely slender, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. On the back, in elegant handwriting, "I'll miss you terribly, darling. All my love always, Sandy." He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on a greeting card hidden in a croquet set, the one Miles Beaumont had left behind when he departed Meredith Downs. "My darling Miles, something to keep you entertained during your exile. They can't keep us apart forever. All my love, Sandy. Miles Beaumont, the English aristocrat, the man Lorna believed was Andy's father. He had been in love with another man. Matt burned both the photograph and the card, one after the other, in the fireplace at the homestead. He remembered what had happened to a well sinker caught with a station hand a few years earlier. The beating, the arrest, the shame that sent the hand packing. He knew what the town would do to Miles if they knew, what they would do to the MacBride family for hiding it. So he burned the evidence and said nothing. He told himself he was protecting Andy. But he was also protecting himself, and the secret he carried about Rose and the note he had read in 1960 and burned on Wallaby Ridge. Some truths couldn't be spoken, some ashes just spread. The Bachelors and Spinsters Ball. Weeks passed. The mining boom filled Wandery Creek with strangers, and still Bonnie stayed, visiting the homestead more often than her claim map required. She and Matt had developed a rhythm lunch together, conversations about sailing and the lugger he was restoring, silences that felt less like gaps and more like shared ground. She asked him to the Bachelors and Spinsters Ball. He said no. She asked again. He said no again, more softly. She arrived at the ball with Steve Glue, a young jackaroo wearing a navy satin gown that she had last worn to her own engagement party. A different engagement, a different lifetime. Matt came with Rhonda Kippen, an old flame of his brother Warren, and he spent the night watching her dance. He saw her laugh at something Steve said. He saw her dip her head, the light catching the line of her neck. He felt something crack open in his chest, something he had kept sealed since the crash. It was the same longing he had seen in Humpty Dumpton's eyes, the man who had told him, "Freedom is finding your life inside your prison." Matt crossed the dance floor and tapped Steve on the shoulder. "My turn." Bonnie looked up, surprised. Matt took her hand and pulled her close. They danced without speaking, and when the music ended, he led her outside to the dark, and under the stars of Bilby Rock, he kissed her. The drive home that night was the most hopeful he had felt in 11 years. He named the feeling, "Welcome to Hope." But when he reached the gate of Meredith Downs, when he saw the shearing shed and felt his body clench, the hope curdled. He went to bed and took a cold shower, trying to wash the memory of her away. He couldn't. She came to the homestead 3 days later to return his dinner jacket. Andy, who had been watching the romance unfold with a child's canny awareness, insisted Matt take her to Wallaby Ridge. They stood on the ridge, looking out over the station. Matt pointed to a grove of twisted eucalypts below. "Jemima's trees," he said. "They're a species that only grows here. My mother planted them." Bonnie said nothing. She waited. Matt heard his sister's voice clear as if she were standing beside him. "Live your bloody life for once." He kissed her again, and this time he didn't let go. The family tree and the secret investigation. That winter, Andy's school set a project for the Pastoralists' Heritage Project. Each student had to draw their family tree and write a story about their parents. The exhibition would be held at the town hall in February. Andy came home with the guidelines. Lorna read them and felt her stomach drop. The truth about Andy's father and about Rose's death could not appear in a school exhibit. The gaps would be too visible. The questions would be too dangerous. "Well, think of something," she said, but she didn't know what. Andy had already started thinking. He had been copying names from the station diaries, building his own list of possible fathers. The roo shooter was on it. Miles Beaumont was on it. He had asked the roo shooter about the scar, and the man had said, "That's a forgetment, Andy. You get to decide what story you make of it." Then a letter arrived from his pen pal Harry Badger. Harry's father had died of mesothelioma, asbestos poisoning, and Harry wrote, "You should ask the lady geologist to help you find your father. She seems like she knows things." Andy took the letter to Bonnie. They were sitting on the porch of her camp, the evening light reddening the dust. He handed her the list of names. "And can you help me find my father?" he asked. "I think maybe he's in England. Miles Beaumont. He used to work here. My mother liked him." Bonnie looked at the list. The roo shooter. Miles Beaumont. A few other names scratched out. She had promised Matt she wouldn't pry into the family's secrets, but she looked at Andy's face earnest, hopeful, desperate, and she made a different promise. "I'll see what I can find," she said. The file and the conference. The postmaster's wife was also making progress. She had learned that the rue shooter received parcels from France, that he had no wife, that he had spent time in a Japanese POW camp. She had added an asterisk to Rose MacBride's file. She had started wondering which man in town was responsible. Sergeant Rundle, meanwhile, was working through the misc defunct drawer that his predecessor had left untouched. He had already solved the Ashbrook case. Betsy Ashbrook had poisoned her husband with botulism, and Weishart had covered it up. Now he was moving to the next file. The label read, MacBride, Rose Annabelle. He hadn't opened it yet, but he would. Bonnie packed for the Sydney Mining Conference. She had arranged to meet a contact who might know the whereabouts of Miles Beaumont. She kissed Matt goodbye at the gate, promising to be back in a week. Matt watched her go. He had the ring in his pocket, a gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He had planned to propose on her return, but as the dust settled on the track, he felt the weight of everything he had not told her. The note, the mine, the truth about Andy's father. He didn't know if the ring would ever leave his pocket. Episode 3, The Unraveling. The geologist arrived in Sydney on a Thursday morning, the humidity wrapping around her like wet wool the moment she stepped off the plane. She had told Matt she was attending the mining conference, which was true. She had not told him she planned to use the trip to find Miles Beaumont. The conference was held at the Hotel Australia on Martin Place. The geologist sat through presentations on nickel laterites and geophysical surveying, her notebook filling with technical diagrams and her mind circling the same question. Where would an English aristocrat hide in a city of 2 million people? She had only a name, a company address from an old letter, and the memory of Andy's face when he handed her the list. On the second day, she found a lead. The Beaumont family had once owned a share in a wool-broking firm near Circular Quay. She took a taxi after the afternoon session, climbed a narrow staircase to an office that smelled of old paper and floor polish, and spoke to a clerk who remembered the name. Lord Beaumont? The clerk said, adjusting his spectacles. Haven't seen him in years, but I believe he keeps a flat in Darling Point. A friend of his comes by occasionally to collect his mail. The geologist wrote down the address. She did not call ahead. The flat was on a tree-lined street, the kind of address that spoke of inherited money and careful discretion. She knocked, and when the door opened, she found herself facing a man in his early 30s, sandy-haired, with the soft hands of someone who had never worked a station. I'm looking for Miles Beaumont, she said. You found me. The geologist measured him. He was not what she expected, not the crediting god Matt had described, not the romantic hero Andy had imagined. He was slight, almost delicate, with a guarded stillness that made her think of a man accustomed to keeping parts of himself hidden. I'm Bonnie. I'm with Hollamby Mining. I'm also a friend of the MacBride family, Andy's family. The Englishman's face changed at the name. Something flickered recognition, wariness, a deeper unease. You'd better come in. The flat was spare, elegant, masculine. A piano stood in the corner, a half-finished watercolor on the easel. The geologist sat on the sofa while Miles poured tea, his movements precise, his silence deliberate. I know about Rose, she said. I know she had a child. I know you were at Meredith Downs when she became pregnant. The Englishman set the teapot down. What exactly do you want? The truth. Andy wants to know who his father is. He thinks it might be you. Miles stared at her. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, hollow sound that held no humor. Oh, God, the poor boy. Is it you? No. He sat down across from her, his hands folded in his lap. I'm not Andy's father. I never Rose and I were never lovers. I couldn't have been. The geologist waited. The Englishman looked at the window, at the light falling through the lace curtains. There's someone, Bonnie. There's someone I love. His name is Sandy. We've been together since before I went to Western Australia. My family sent me to the outback to get me away from him. He paused. It didn't work. The geologist felt the pieces click into place. The apology letter Andy had found, the mysterious card Matt had burned, the way the Englishman had always kept Rose at arm's length. He was not the father. He could not have been. Then who? She asked. I don't know. Rose never told me. But I think Miles stopped. I think she was protecting someone close to her. The geologist left the flat an hour later, her mind churning. She had come to Sydney hoping to find Andy's father. Instead, she had found a man who loved another man and a secret that seemed to grow larger the more she learned. She called the homestead that night. The mother answered. "I need to talk to you," the geologist said. "Not about Miles, about Rose, the real story." There was a long silence. Then the mother said, "Come home. We'll talk on Wallaby Ridge." Lorna's confession on the ridge. 3 days after the geologist returned to Meredith Downs, she and the mother walked up to Wallaby Ridge in the late afternoon. The light was gold and long, the shadows of the eucalypts stretching across the red earth like fingers. The matriarch moved slowly, her knees stiff but her back was straight. They sat on the flat rock where Matt had first kissed the geologist. Below them, the station lay quiet, the shearing shed a dark shape against the fading sky. "I've never told anyone," the matriarch said. "Not all of it." The geologist did not speak. She waited. "Rose didn't fall," the mother said. "She jumped. She took the baby to the mine shaft and she jumped." She meant to kill them both. The words hung in the air.